Hello, my fellow lovers of love stories. My name is Maria, and I just celebrated my 19th birthday. Today, I'll be sharing a story about how I ended up helping my uncle during a camping trip, right inside our tent. It's the first time I'm recounting this experience, so settle in and listen closely. It's bound to leave you speechless. Even now, it feels a little unreal. I suppose introductions are a good starting point. My name's Maria, I'm 19, and I've always been close to my dad, Daniel. He's one of those reliable, down-to-earth types who's always up for an adventure, especially if it involves nature. So, when he suggested we go on a mountain hike, I didn't hesitate. Fresh air, a good workout, and a chance to clear my mind before heading back to college sounded ideal. What I hadn't expected was for him to invite Leo. Leo has been my dad's best friend for as long as I can remember. They met in their 20s, years before I was born. He used to visit often when I was a child, and I remember looking up to him like the fun, cool uncle figure. He always had a joke or an exciting story to share. But when I turned 14, he moved away for work, and I hadn't seen him since, until now. The moment I saw him again, it was as if something had shifted. He wasn't the same person I remembered from my childhood. It was still him, of course, but he seemed different, older, more distinguished. His rugged appearance had only improved with age. Broad shoulders, a strong jawline, and an effortless confidence in how he carried himself. I'd never really paid attention to men like that before. Guys my age still seemed so unsure of themselves. But Leo was a man in every sense of the word. I couldn't help but notice how much I had grown and changed in the past 5 years, too. When Dad mentioned that Leo would be joining us, I hadn't thought much of it. But standing at the trailhead, watching him adjust his backpack, I felt a strange combination of excitement and nerves. I hoped it wasn't obvious, but deep down I was hyper-aware of him, his movements, the tone of his voice, and every glance he sent my way. Each time our eyes met, my heart would flutter, and I had to keep reminding myself to calm down. He was my dad's best friend, for goodness sake. This was absurd. After about 7 kilometers of hiking, we stopped for a break. We found a small clearing with a fallen log and a few large rocks that made perfect seats. Dad dug through his bag for snacks, but I was too restless to sit, so I wandered a short distance away, pretending to admire the scenery while stretching. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Leo pulling off his shirt. I swear my heart skipped a beat. He stood there wringing out the sweat-drenched fabric, and I couldn't look away. The sunlight hit his back, highlighting his muscles as they flexed. His chest was broad and defined, glistening faintly from the hike. It wasn't just that he was in great shape. It was the confidence he exuded without even trying. I didn't mean to stare, but my eyes wouldn't move. My thoughts raced and heat rose to my cheeks. Instinctively, I lifted my hair off my neck, trying to cool down, and without realizing it, I bit my lip. It was an automatic reaction, like my body had a mind of its own. Then it happened. Leo looked up, and our eyes met. He didn't say a word, but his gaze held something knowing, like he'd caught me in the act. My stomach flipped, and I quickly looked away, so fast I nearly stumbled. My face burned with embarrassment. What was I thinking? He probably thought I was some silly kid getting flustered over nothing. I forced myself to sit down on the log, grabbing a granola bar from my dad. I smiled as if nothing had happened, though inside, my thoughts were a whirlwind. Leo didn't comment, but I felt his eyes on me occasionally as we packed up to continue the hike. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just a fleeting moment, but I couldn't shake the way it lingered. That night, as we set up our tents, I tried to focus on the task to distract myself. My tent was simple, a small one-person setup I'd used before. Nearby, Leo was struggling with his, and I heard him mutter a quiet curse. When I glanced over, he stood holding a broken tent pole, his frustration obvious. Dad came over to help, but after inspecting it, they both agreed the tent was unusable. Without thinking, I blurted, "You can use mine." The word surprised even me. It's small, but there's enough room for 2. Dad hesitated, his expression a mix of surprise and contemplation. It was an unusual situation, me sharing a tent with Leo, but there wasn't much choice. After a moment, Dad shrugged. "If you're okay with it," he said. Leo didn't say much, just nodded and grabbed his sleeping bag. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't even sure why I had offered. It just felt right to have him close. Inside the tent, we laid our sleeping bags side by side. It was snug, but not uncomfortable. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Dad had already settled into his tent, and the faint noise of his zipper closing felt like the world outside was fading away, leaving just Leo and me in this small, shared space. At first, we made small talk about the hike and the weather, but soon the conversation deepened. He asked about my college plans and what I wanted to do afterward. I admitted I wasn't sure yet, that I was still figuring things out. He listened intently in a way that made me feel seen and valued. Then, with a teasing grin, he asked if I had a fiancé waiting back home. I laughed and shook my head, telling him, "Not even close." He seemed surprised or maybe just curious. He confessed that he'd been single for 5 years, unable to find someone who truly understood him. There was something vulnerable in his tone, as though he wasn't just filling the silence. A quiet pause followed, heavy with unspoken thoughts. My heart raced, the air between us charged with a tension I couldn't name. The warmth of his body so close to mine was almost overwhelming. I could nearly sense his breath against my skin. It felt as though every nerve in me was alive, heightened to its fullest. Without much thought, my hand moved instinctively, sliding beneath the edge of his sleeping bag. My fingers traced his waist, slipping underneath the fabric of his pants. His body stiffened as his hand darted down, gripping mine firmly. "What are you doing?" he murmured, his voice low, tinged with surprise. I couldn't answer, frozen in the intensity of the moment, my heart pounding wildly. I knew it was reckless, maybe even wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I tried again, this time with more intention. Slowly, cautiously, my fingers tested the waters. He resisted at first, his hand staying on mine as though to stop me, but then something changed. His grip softened and his breathing grew deeper, almost uneven. In the stillness of the tent, just a short distance from where my dad's snores filled the silence, the air between us buzzed with tension. I moved with care, deliberate and unhurried, letting my fingers roam gently. I wanted to take my time, to absorb every detail. His body reacted in ways that made my heart pound harder. Neither of us spoke. It was as if we both knew that breaking the silence would shatter the moment. The only sounds were his unsteady breathing, the rustle of fabric, and the thundering of my own heartbeat. When my fingers brushed his skin, everything shifted. His body tensed, as if he was holding his breath. His hand shot down again, grasping mine, his fingers encircling my wrist. Even in the dim light of the tent, the shock in his eyes was unmistakable. His whisper cut through the silence. "What are you doing?" Again, I couldn't respond. My heart was racing so fast it felt like fire coursing through me. I held his gaze, searching for the words I couldn't seem to form. For a moment, time seemed suspended, hanging delicately in the balance. I felt the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers, the roughness at his waistline, the tension rippling through his muscles. He exhaled a quiet, involuntary sound, somewhere between a sigh and a groan. Though soft, it resonated in the air around us, filling the space. I sensed his resistance faltering like a dam about to burst. His hand slipped away from my wrist, his fingers grazing my arm as they fell. When it ended, I lay there, my heart racing, every inch of my skin tingling. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable but thick with unspoken words. His warmth lingered close to me, our bodies almost touching. His breathing had slowed, deeper now, as though he was trying to regain control. I didn't want to move, fearful of breaking the fragile magic of the moment. I closed my eyes, the rhythm of his breath the last thing I heard as I drifted into sleep, the sensation of his skin under my fingers imprinted in my memory. When I woke the next morning, it felt like returning to reality after a vivid dream. The sun had barely risen, and the tent was still dimly lit. Outside, the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds signaled the forest's quiet awakening. For a fleeting second, I forgot where I was. I became acutely aware of it. The warmth radiating from Leo's body right beside mine, his steady breathing filling the small space. We were so close that only the thin material of our sleeping bags separated us. My heart began to race once more, as vivid memories of the previous night surged back. Every touch, every sound, and the way his body had responded to mine. Staring at the roof of the tent, I tried to steady myself, unwilling to disturb the fragile, intimate silence that lingered between us. But eventually, the day called, and we had to get moving. I could hear my dad rustling around outside, the sound of his tent unzipping followed by his stretching and preparing for the day ahead. Turning onto my side, I feigned sleep, silently hoping Leo would step out first. He did. I watched him quietly unzip the tent and slip outside into the crisp morning air. I stayed behind for a moment longer, breathing deeply in an attempt to calm the storm of emotions inside me. When I finally emerged, everything seemed back to normal, too normal. My dad was already brewing coffee, chatting with Leo about the upcoming part of the hike. It was as if nothing unusual had happened, as though we hadn't crossed a line that couldn't be undone. I forced myself to join the conversation, trying hard to focus on the day ahead. But every time my eyes flicked to Leo, flashes of the night before would rush back, the quickening of his breath, the heat of his skin beneath my touch. The thoughts were impossible to shake. That day's hike was tougher and longer, the trail growing steeper as we climbed higher. My dad led the way, seemingly tireless, while Leo and I trailed behind, sometimes side by side, other times with a bit of distance between us. We talked, but it felt different. An unspoken tension hung between us, thick in the air. Every time our eyes met, it sparked, an unspoken reminder of what had happened. My thoughts kept drifting to the night ahead. We had one more night in the mountains, one more night in that cramped tent. I couldn't help wanting more, even knowing I shouldn't. The memory of his touch, the sound of his breathing, they consumed my thoughts. By the time we set up camp that evening, the sun was dipping low, casting elongated shadows through the trees. We found another clearing, much like the previous night. My dad fell into his routine, pitching his tent and arranging his gear. Leo and I did the same, setting up ours side by side, close but not quite touching. There was a palpable boundary between us, invisible but undeniable, and neither of us seemed to know how to cross it. Dinner was subdued. We sat around the campfire, eating and exchanging small talk about the day's trek. My dad, though visibly tired, seemed content, sharing stories and cracking jokes, but I could hardly concentrate. My mind was already back in the tent, preoccupied with the possibilities of what the night might bring once the fire burned out, and we all retired to sleep. I couldn't figure out what Leo was thinking. He appeared calm, focused on listening to my dad's stories, but every so often his gaze would flicker toward me for just an instant. When the time came to call it a night, my heart felt like it might burst. We crawled into the tent, squeezed into the same tight space with our sleeping bags pressed together. I could hear my dad settling in just a few feet away, the sounds of his tent zipping and the faint rustle as he got comfortable. The atmosphere was thick, reminiscent of the night before. The tension, the silence, the charged air hanging between us. For a while, we lay there without a word. Leo's breathing was steady at first, but it shifted. I could tell he was awake, just as I was. Then, in a hushed tone, almost as if speaking to himself, he murmured that this wasn't something we could do. His voice was soft, yet firm, like he was trying to convince himself as much as he was telling me. But I was already too far gone, the air between us heavy with everything unsaid. I moved closer, pressing my body against his. Through the sleeping bag, I could feel his warmth, the tension in his muscles. My heart was racing so wildly it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Acting on instinct, I leaned in, my lips finding his. For a moment he didn't react, remaining still as though he was resisting. But then something gave way, and he kissed me back. It was as though everything we had been suppressing came pouring out all at once. The cramped tent didn't allow for much movement. I couldn't position myself the way I wanted, couldn't take control the way I craved. Instead, I slid lower, my hands moving down his body toward his pants. Slowly, I let my head follow. He resisted at first, his hands pressing against me gently, trying to stop me, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop. In that moment, everything else faded away. His deep, shaky breaths filled the tent, his hands finding their way to my hair, his fingers tangling in it. I felt his touch on my face, gentle but insistent. The sound of his breathing and the way his body responded to every movement drove me wild. His tension was palpable, his muscles tight as he fought to keep quiet. My dad snoring, just a few feet away, served as a constant reminder of where we were. That awareness only heightened the intensity. As I moved faster, I heard a few low groans escape him, and for a moment I feared my dad might wake up. But the steady rhythm of his snores reassured me. The moment felt overwhelming, every sensation building inside me like a fire. Every nerve in my body was alight, every breath heavy with need. All I wanted was to be closer, to take over completely, to lose myself in him. It felt like I was teetering on the edge of something, a point of no return. But the tent, with its tight walls and low ceiling, was maddeningly restrictive. Every time I tried to shift, my shoulder bumped the side or my leg hit the edge. There was no room to move, no way to position myself how I wanted. Frustration mounted as the confined space reminded me of its limits. I let out a quiet sigh, trying to make it work. My hands moved deliberately, exploring his body with care, trying to make the most of the little space I had. It wasn't enough, though. I craved control, wanted to set the pace, to release all the pent-up energy I felt. But every time I tried to adjust, the tense boundaries held me back. Leo seemed to sense my frustration. His hands moved over me with a firmness that was meant to calm, his fingers stroking my hair and brushing my face. It helped a little, but it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted more. The tent was like a cruel joke, a tease of how much I wanted him and how little I could do about it. I closed my eyes, focusing on his touch, channeling all my tension into the deliberate movements of my hands. I explored every inch I could reach, slow and purposeful, trying to make the moment last. His breathing grew heavier, his body alternating between tense and relaxed under my touch. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw, intense, and unforgettable. The next morning, everything felt weighted, not physically, but emotionally. A heavy silence lingered between Leo and me as we packed up the tents and gear. The motions felt mechanical, almost automatic. My dad was in a cheerful mood, raving about how great the hike had been and suggesting we do it again soon. Leo and I nodded along, forcing smiles. Every time our eyes met, though, the tension was there, unspoken but undeniable. The hike back down the mountain felt much longer than the climb up. My legs ached, though not just from the trek. My body still carried the echoes of the night before. Every touch, every sound replaying in my head like a loop. I kept holding on to the memory, unsure if I'd ever feel that again. The reality of returning to normal life was sinking in, leaving a knot in my stomach. Leo was quiet for most of the descent. He kept his distance, either a few steps ahead or lagging slightly behind, never staying too close. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it lingered. I couldn't stop wondering what was going through his head. Did he regret it? Was he trying to push it from his mind? I couldn't figure him out, and it was driving me insane. By the time we reached the parking lot, my dad was already planning another hike, chatting about new trails we could try next time. Leo nodded along and smiled, but it didn't feel genuine. It never quite reached his eyes. We loaded the gear into the car, and the drive back to the city was mostly silent. My dad dozed off in the passenger seat, leaving Leo and me sitting in the back, both staring out of our own windows. The silence was heavy, thick with unspoken words, but neither of us dared to break it. When we finally got back to the city, my dad invited Leo over for dinner the following weekend. Leo agreed, but I couldn't tell if he truly wanted to or if he was just being polite. We unpacked the car, exchanged goodbyes, and watched as Leo walked to his car. I found myself wondering if he would glance back, but he didn't. The days that followed blurred together. I struggled to concentrate on anything. My thoughts kept wandering back to the hike, the tent, and everything that had unfolded between us. I kept glancing at my phone, half hoping for a message from Leo, but it never came. Eventually, I couldn't take the waiting anymore and sent him a text. "Hey, wanna meet up?" It took a few hours for him to respond. When he did, the reply was brief. "Yeah, tomorrow." My heart raced. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place that was always half empty. He was already seated when I arrived, tucked into a corner table with a coffee in front of him. When he looked up and saw me for a fleeting moment, it felt normal, just two people meeting for coffee. But when I sat down, the familiar silence crept in again. At first, we stuck to small talk. Work, the weather, the hike. It was like we were both avoiding the real conversation, skirting around it. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "So, are we going to talk about it?" He looked down at his coffee, his fingers tapping lightly on the cup. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Do you regret it?" I asked, the words feeling heavy as they left my mouth. He shook his head almost too quickly. "No, I don't know where we go from here." I didn't have an answer either, but I knew one thing. I didn't want it to end. "Do you want to come over?" I asked. The question hung in the air between us. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah." We didn't speak much on the way to my place. The tension between us felt different this time. Not awkward, just full of anticipation, like we both knew what was about to happen. When we got inside, the silence lingered. I set my keys on the counter, and for a moment we just stood there facing each other. Then he stepped closer. This time, there was no rush, no cramped space or need to keep quiet. There was room to breathe, to move, to explore. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and everything else melted away. The rest of the night became a blur of heat and touch. It wasn't hurried or restrained like it had been in the tent. This was slow, intentional. We had the time and space to lose ourselves in each other. His hands wandered over me, lingering as if he were memorizing every detail. I did the same, savoring every moment, letting myself sink completely into him. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the quiet. His breathing was steady, and his hand moved gently across my back, tracing lazy circles. For the first time in a long while, it felt real, more real than anything I'd experienced before.